Hello, and welcome everybody to the latest episode of the Traveller in the Evening podcast. It's a special episode again because it's the third and final episode in our series where we're discussing really the rise and fall of the revolutionary left since 1945. Those who've been listening will remember that at the first episode in the series, John Game and I talked generally about the whole topic. But then for the second part, we focused in on the first half of the period under discussion, which is 1945 to 1985. And that took us from the end of the war, the changes by the Labour government, the rise of the very slow rise at that point of the Trotskyist revolutionary left, its relations with social democracy and with the Communist Party. We addressed all those issues and how they panned out from the end of the war through to really the late 60s, early 70s. You can say this is very much the rise of the revolutionary left, here in Britain anyway. After that, the years from then and through to the miners' strike were really years of partial retreat, although there were big, epic struggles really in 1972, 1974 in Britain. Nevertheless, the tide was going out. So our theme has been in the discussion that 1985, the defeat of the miners' strike, represents a great turning point in this story, and that the history of the revolutionary left since that time is really a story of pretty much continuous decline. And so that's what we're here to talk about tonight. And when I say we, it's John Game again. For those who don't know, John and I were members of the Socialist Workers' Party from the 1980s on. I was expelled in the 1990s. John remained a member through to, I think, 2013 or whenever the Comrade Delta rape case business happened. But we're going to take in all of that period, starting with 1985. So that's since that's the great turning point in our story. I want to draw John in at this moment to say something about the setting. So to remind you, we did talk at length about the impact of the strike on us personally and on many other people. But I think our starting point for tonight should be really the impact on other people, because although the defeat of the miners was such a great turning point, nevertheless, it initially had a kind of, it seems odd to say this, a positive impact, certainly for some of us as on the revolutionary left, because a lot of people were very unhappy about the defeat of the miners and were looking for answers. So with that said, I'd like to draw my old comrade John Game into the discussion to say something about that context with which we begin the second half of our story.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I mean, I wanted to start with what I think is a bit of a paradox about the 1980s. I mean, the first thing to say about it is exactly what Andy said. It was, the miners' strike was a huge defeat. We'd had, defeats before the miners' strike, the defeat of the miners' strike. There'd been this whole policy of what we used to call, Andy will remember the phrase, salami tactics by the Thatcher government, going after one union after another. I was personally, I say this with great pride, I joined a few years before Andy did. This was because I went up to Warrington, where the riot police were attacking print workers. And I mean, these strikes were characterized by two things. And I'm not going into the miners' strike again. It's just, it sets the scene for what we're going to talk about. First of all, enormous police violence of a kind which had not been seen in industrial relations up until that point in Britain. I'm not talking about the post-war period, obviously. There had been violence of that kind in other strikes. That was the first thing, and that clearly had a radicalizing effect on me, and that's why I joined the SWP. Watching batons going up and down on people's heads has a radicalizing effect, always. But the second thing about the period, which was very depressing, actually, was that the levels of trade union solidarity that had been seen during the 1970s had just vanished. And in saying that, I don't want to suggest there wasn't enormous solidarity for the miners. There was. But the story that was always told of the 70s, and again, I am setting the stage for the 80s, was in 1972 when the miners went on strike, they just had to hang a miners' banner on a bridge and the railways all stopped. By the time of the miners' strike, there's actually miners crossing picket lines, which was deeply, deeply shocking for a generation that had grown up with the older traditions of shop floor militancy, panel militancy in the case of the miners, etc. So it seemed very depressing. So the SWP at that point, and we are discussing the SWP at the moment, I think was correct to recognise that this was an enormous shift. I mean, like many discussions inside the SWP, you have on the one hand factional reasons the discussion is happening, and then you have the objective reasons, and sometimes it doesn't quite fit together. So it's complicated in that way. But I think it was a fairly kind of convincing perspective. Now, the paradox is that despite all this very grim situation, recognised in different ways by different political forces. So Eric Hobsbawm, the forward march of Labour halted. He was early to the party. Then you have, Stuart Hall's, Marxism Today and Policing the Crisis. It's important to remember the Brixton riots erupting in 81. Despite all of this, the SWP grows during this period. I mean, there's a fantastic little story that Ian Birchall tells in his biography of Cliff, that between 1980 and 1984, and these were grim days, in terms of the retreat, the SWP grew from 2,000 to 4,000, something it hadn't even achieved during the height of the Anti-Nazi League, and this growth, I think it's important in terms of the story and how it unfolds to understand that there were a number of factors behind this. I think the first thing was, something which we've lived with ever since, actually, in terms of arguments about neoliberalism, was the general political polarization that was created by Thatcher. It was a minority of people. Labour did terribly in the elections, but our electoral system is weird. There were quite a lot of people utterly repulsed by Thatcher, utterly repulsed by what she'd done to the miners. And I think, many of those people, many of them who'd been involved in previous struggles, desperately wanted answers as to what was happening. And most importantly, they wanted some kind of ideological resistance to a general situation, which I can remember speaking with somebody who worked in BT. He was a shop steward in BT. And he told me that the people he worked with, who he used to stand on picket lines with, were buying shares. This is like 85. Do you remember Don't Ask Sid or whatever that stupid advert was that they had on telly? And so there was this, sense of ideological marginalisation, but which people push back against a lot. Now, people like my mate who worked in British Telecom were always quite isolated. But, I mean, as soon as I left college, I worked in local government. And what you actually found was the growth of white-collar militancy at that time. I mean, it had already started in the 70s. I think Duncan Hallis had to write something about it because manual workers were dismissive of them. But manual workers were largely beaten to death by this stage. White-collar workers were much more militant and people in public services. And the SWP, I can remember going to union meetings which had hundreds of people at it. I mean, a few decades later, I found out they couldn't even get quorum. But there were hundreds of people there. You had strikes where we arranged payments and you'd see thousands of people taking strikes payments and stuff like that. And I think that younger layer, it was made up of students who'd been involved sometimes in minor support committees, learned a lot about the labour movement like that. It also involved younger layers of the working class who basically wanted a bit more than their parents had had because of the development of higher education, had managed to get into local government. And then, of course, social issues like racism, like sexism, all of those things. I just want to pause for a second because most people, particularly because of what happened eventually to the SWP, would imagine, that we were awful on those questions at the time. But I can remember, and Andy, I know will be saying something about the militant later, but I can remember we used to take the piss out of the militant because they had such an awful class unity is all that matters. I mean, I can remember in local government having huge arguments when there was a Black Now Go was set up. It was essentially about getting more black managers in. And I had a furious debate, actually, with another SWP member, where he was saying, oh, it doesn't matter, they're all managers anyway. I said, no, it really does matter in terms of it's our responsibility to raise the issue of racism wherever it occurs, because that's the way you build unity of militant people inside the working class. And I tell that story. And, there was also Section 28 about gay people. I can remember one extraordinary exchange where a friend of mine, we were out drinking in a pub and some bloke came up to us and accused us of being gay. And my instant response as a young SWP member was, I happen not to be gay, but was to say, yes, I am. What the fuck are you going to do about it? And this was not a wise thing to do in all sorts of ways. My friend almost died. We were in a pub in East London. And the bloke just backs off and says, oh, my brother is gay, actually, And so there was lots of, in fact, during that period, we had the Leninist idea of the tribunes of the oppressed, etc. And I think, whatever you talk about, what happens later, and even what was happening at the time, the rather ridiculous arguments about do women benefit from women's oppression, etc. We were quite core on those things, actually, in terms of the political front we presented. That also reflected the wider impact of what was happening with Thatcher and stuff. So you had these various movements we were relating to, and there was a kind of learning process going on. You wanted to interrupt me?
Well, I always want to interrupt you.
As always, Andy.
But I wanted to, no, I was really wanting to affirm what you're saying, actually, because there's this irony or paradox that we have to start with, which is that the second half of our story begins with the defeat of the miners, which was such a dreadful event in so many ways. Saying that is so important to our argument. And yet, nevertheless, my memory of that time was of very high levels of militancy. Not only the memories of the strike that we spoke about. I mean, to give you an example, by 1983, I arrived at university. But before then, I'd been 7 years in the Royal Navy, where I served a full apprenticeship. And I'd been expelled from the Navy for my political activism. I'd actually built a little cell of the Anti-Nazi League on a naval base. And I took people down in the coach down to A&L events, or down to Brockwell Park, if you recall. So I'd been quite, I considered myself an anarchist. I came onto campus. I joined the SWP really because of the miners' strikes. I mean, they were the people who were doing the real work on campus, supporting the miners. So I ended up spending all my time with them because that's what I wanted to do, and the anarchist group wouldn't do that. But what I also recall is, so what I'm trying to get across here is you have this defeat, but after the end of the miners' strike, there was real fury, as you say, about the defeat, about the betrayal, or, as it was perceived, of the TUC and the Labour Party, of Neil Kinnock, all these people who refused to support the miners. There was genuine anger about that, but among a wide layer of people who had supported the miners one way or another, even if not as activists, if they'd sympathise with them. People were angry at the developments, and that paradoxically created room for growth for the SWP. You could talk to people about the betrayal. You could talk about what should have happened. You could talk about the traditions of the labour movement, and people would have that discussion. And it wasn't just, the conversations you had with workers. On my campus, we built up from a tiny SWP group. After I joined it in late 83, early 84, we grew to a really huge group on campus so that we dominated the branch in town. So we had like 20 odd members, many of whom went on to be SWP full-timers, including myself. But the point is that it was an electrifying atmosphere on campus because there were also cuts taking place and threats to the grants, student grants coming from Michael Heseltine. So there were waves of occupations across the country. I regularly went to student union meetings of, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students, 600, 700, 800 people. And I learned my politics there. And we learned also to relate to people to the right of us. So, in our Labour club on campus, the first item on their agenda at every meeting was, what would the SWP, the Socialist Worker Students, like to add to this agenda? That was always the first item, because we went every week and we had great relations with them. And we also ended up leading occupations.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Socialist Worker, the SWP Central Committee used to call us up in York and say, can you help spread the occupation? Can you go and speak in Manchester? Can you start an occupation on your campus? And we used to, we led a whole series of occupations of Heslington Hall, the Admiral. But my point is that it was a highly polarised situation. And what I want to put to you is a sort of paradox that the SWPs, as with much of the left's response to this, was to say we need to go back to the revolutionary traditions of the labour movement, to look to rebuild the strength of the labour movement. And they put this argument to people, but the people they recruited on that basis weren't essentially, a new wave of working class militants. They were often, yes, many went into NALGO, which was increasingly, a radicalised union, as you say. But essentially the pitch was, we are the last ones standing, not just ourselves in the SWP, but with the militants. We are the last trot standing. We stand for the revolutionary tradition of the working class. We look to renew that tradition and, in a sense, go back to how things were. But at the same time, we were pitching that argument to a new political mood. I don't think that was the language used at that time, but it's the language that became used, saying what we have to relate to a highly political situation, not we have to build our industrial strength. On the shop floor, we're going to try and recruit by being political. Now, the militant were more literally minded than us. So, and I went to Liverpool as the SWP's organiser just after the peak of the militants' leadership there, where they had led the council workforce and the electorate in opposing Tory cuts to the budget, were refusing to set a budget. It led to a huge confrontation with the Tories. I don't want to tell the whole story of it. There's no point. The militant essentially backed down in the end. But I don't want to talk about that. What I want to do is just affirm what you said about their approach to these questions. They, like us, wanted to reassert the traditions of the working class. But for them, those traditions didn't essentially include the idea of communists as the tribune of the oppressed. It was all about working class unity. So in Liverpool, they never mentioned Ireland, which is odd because there's a huge Orange Order in Liverpool that marches through the city every year, as well as obviously many supporters of the Provost.
I can just interrupt you quickly because there's a funny story about that, which is I can remember in party notes sometime in 86, 87, it warned comrades not to wear the SWP red fist if they were out drinking in Liverpool because people might confuse it with the red hand of Ulster. And so,
very, very good advice. I mean, I was there once when it was actually a CPSA broad left meeting on in Liverpool, and we came out for lunch. And just as we came out, the Orange Order were coming around the corner. They were having a march coming up. It's called Hardman Street in Liverpool, and the SWP members started shouting at them, ooh, up the rah, and all this kind of thing. And suddenly, they'd only seen the front of this march. There were thousands of them, and they started running towards us, and we had to disperse across Liverpool. But anyway, the militant never mentioned that. They never mentioned it they had nothing to say about Ireland. If you asked them, it was an embarrassment to them. They wanted working class unity. Workers should unite. They didn't have a view on the national question. But they had that attitude too towards women, towards black sections in the Labour Party, which they opposed. I don't want to go on about it because I'm not here to kick their shins. It's way too late.
It's never too late, Andy. No.
But it bears out what you're saying. We very much defined ourselves against them in Liverpool in that we would take on these political questions. So, for example, I wanted to call a fringe meeting at Ford Halewood, just outside, so that we had a member of the SWP National Committee worked in there on the shop floor and a few other supporters. And I wanted them to call a meeting on gay rights. And the National Committee member of the Socialist Worker Party said to me, there's no point because there are no gay men in Fort Halewood. Right? So, it wasn't always easy to push this line, but that was what we were pushing, was we have to address these political questions. And one last thing on that is that when the miners' strike ended, I was finishing my degree, and when I finished it, the strike ended, I was sent by the SWP Central Committee to intervene, to help with the Pontefract branch of the SWP, because it contained quite a few miners who had joined during the strike. And the idea was to hold that branch together after the defeat. And the point I want to make is that the key to doing that was always seen as talking about oppression, and what, not simply to focus on the industrial situation, which was frankly depressing. But what differentiated us was issues to do with oppression, being tribunes of the oppressed. And my point is that was the line that was that's what I was told to do there. And I thought that was absolutely the correct thing to do.
Yeah, this allows me, in some ways, it's a perfect link to what I think became the greatest strength and the greatest weakness of the SWP, which is that at that point, we were very confident in our own politics. We also had quite a serious base in all sorts of sections. It was limited. Our industrial comrades, as you said, with the miners, were very depressed for good reason, But I can remember public meetings on all sorts of issues to do with the history of revolutionary politics, to do with the Labour Party, to do also with issues of oppression, where we literally have hundreds of people there. And we did it by pursuing precisely the strategy which you've defined. And what that meant was that you have this confidence. We're an organisation that's growing. We're not afraid to admit that the general situation is bad, but we're like a beacon for people who desperately want to fight back or have some way of fighting back. I can remember meetings, I'm sorry to go, I know you have a animus towards us Nalgo comrades, but I could remember, public meetings in Stratford where the whole shop stewards committee would turn up to debate gay oppression. Quite astonishing. I do think that is genuinely worth remembering. But the outcome of all that is there was a very high level of consensus within the organisation. I always remember Alex Klinikos saying, "Comrades, I know a lot of you are worried by the lack of debate. But the truth is, we're all in agreement with the general analysis. We also know that the way we're attracting people is through our politics. It's a combination of agitation and abstract propaganda. Don't worry. When the big struggles come, we'll be tearing each other to bits again," is what he said. And actually, that did reflect what the membership thought. So when you add these various people who I know we got to know 20 or 30 years later, who are obsessed with us putting in our programme that we were opposed to the monarchy and things like that, most comrades just thought these were fucking wingbats. And actually, in truth, they were much madder than we were. And so there was the sense in which we were very confident. We understood the situation was tough, but we also had very good, I know I shouldn't, but just to deflect a little bit, on paper sales, you'd have queues of people wanting to have a discussion with you. It's unimaginable now, but I can remember it very clearly. What's the weakness of all that? The weakness is that it fostered a culture of unanimity, basically. And I think some of this was just objective. We genuinely didn't have a lot that we disagreed with the leadership about. And so I'm talking about the late 80s, etc. And I think it produced an atmosphere, which we're about to talk about. When things turn bad, there's absolutely, look, the meetings were quite interesting in those days, despite the fact that the conclusions were always the same as ever. But they were often quite lively and people would debate this and that. Given the horrors of what was going on around us, it was like a beacon. People would really enjoy coming along and discussing the ins and outs of the German Revolution or the Portuguese Revolution, or indeed, what's our position on prostitution and all of these kinds of questions. people enjoyed it. People got very good, actually, at holding people's attention. Not me, I never got good at that. But, having debates. I can remember trade unionists that we had who could really debate Labour Party people really well. And that was a talent which, to jump forward, when things started to go bad, I can remember you said I was in the SWP to 2013. I was formerly. But, what I can remember is when the crisis of respect broke out, I was just shocked at how shit people were at taking people with them, something we were very good at during that period. Despite, I think, in some ways, legitimate accusations of sectarianism, legitimate accusations, we were, what was the phrase from the 70s, friendly sectarians, good-humoured sectarians. You could come to our meeting, and as long as you weren't ahead the ball, you could have a good discussion. I think all of that stopped.
I recall the Marxism events because they were, in a way that's kind of hard to explain to people today. What I'm calling the Marxism events are the annual conference that the SWP has, not conference lectures and open talks. And they have it down in London. It used to be at ULU, SOAS. It was spread across both colleges and other colleges. And it was absolutely huge. I mean, there were thousands and thousands of people there. I can remember being in big rooms, heaving with people, talking about very abstruse questions of philosophy. I mentioned last week that for several years I got the gig talking about anarchism, Marxism and anarchism. And I would be talking, I would say there were 250, 300 people in the room with a big section of anarchists who'd come to debate it. Because at the time I was quite friendly with people in the anarchist workers group, but I won't go into that. But they came along and they brought friends. And we had a big debate that was tense but enjoyable and actually comradely. So there was a lot of that kind of upside. But what I sense is the shift in gravity from, defending past positions and the centrality of the working class and what you called Uberism, actually, the working class as it actually is, where it is. Talking about that, but talking about it to other people. It's because that was all that was on the table. And the question is, when did that transform itself into something else? I wasn't there when this actually happened because, as I've mentioned quite a few times in these podcasts, I was expelled from the SWP in 1994. All I'll say about that is that it started off with me just being a nerdy philosophy geek Marxist who wanted to argue about things he disagreed with, which were principally to do with, doesn't really matter, but one of the main issues was about Lukasz's history and class consciousness. The debate doesn't matter, and it didn't really matter then, because what I learned really, really quickly, which surprised me, was that the people I was debating and the way they conducted the debate was really risible. It was at a low, not just a low intellectual level, but it was dishonest. It was people just trying to show their loyalty to what they thought was a central committee position or something like that, a position that had some authority to it, which I was seen as opposing. And what really shocked me was how crap people were. People who didn't even understand the argument would put a lot of work into denouncing me and things like that. And that made me really think about what was happening in the SWP. I can't say that I had a good analysis of it, but you could see there was something really rotten about the way the leadership ran. And then after I was expelled in 94, there was a long hiatus for me when I went on demos and things, but I didn't have anything to do with the SWP. And that was when the respect thing kicked off. And I'd like you to talk a bit more in depth about that, or not necessarily at length, but because I found it was absurd, some of the things that happened in the SWP's relationship to George Galloway and other people in respect. It was absurd. But I thought it absolutely demonstrated one of their fundamental problems was that they started treating other people the way they treated their members. They just assumed that that they would call the shots. And I think it was it made the SWP extremely brittle, but not in a way that was obvious until it made contact with the outside world like that. As soon as it tried to work with, the people it tried to work with in respect, which wasn't just Galloway, it drew in other forces, but as soon as it tried to relate to them, it was done in the most sectarian way that was completely counterproductive, even from their own point of view. I mean, they blew themselves up completely. I won't say any more about it, but throw it over to you because you were very... Well, I was quite involved in it. commenting from the outside. I think I would have been looking at what was going on nearly every day when it was falling apart, I'd say. But I think you were as well from the other side, actually, because you were still an SWP supporter at that
sort of,
point.
yeah. I mean, I want to do just what I did with the 80s. I wanted to give a brief preamble because I don't think you can understand what happened with respect unless you understand a bit of what happened in the 90s. And I don't want to, go over my failure to support you in 1994, although I suspect this is the whole point of this podcast. But let's just, leave that aside. No, for me, the big turning point, I think there were all sorts of things. There was this very weird moment with the poll tax, which we haven't discussed, where the militant actually got a head start on us because they were central to setting up no poll tax payments. We were still arguing in retrospect, it's understandable, but it showed how much we were still within that Hooverist mindset. When we gave it up, it got worse, by the way. But anyway, we said the key was to get people in the local poll tax offices to go on strike. I can remember as a local government worker trying to go to local poll tax offices to get support on that basis. And it was very clear that it wasn't a runner. The local councils weren't stupid. They'd recruited the most conservative existing workers they could. And also, of course, the newer workers they'd recruited, they all knew their jobs depended on precisely this function. So it was never going to happen. And at a certain point, as often happens with the SWP, it actually stopped happening later on. But in those days, it still happened. They said, right, we've made a mistake. Okay. And then they threw themselves into the poll tax stuff. And again, this Tribune of the Oppressed stuff, the militant denounced people who were rioting. We supported people who were rioting, all of that. That was kind of the instinct. And so there was a kind of process of trying to work out how to adjust to this situation where suddenly the political polarization around Thatcherism was everything. And the old Hooverist politics really had very little to contribute to the situation. And I think that was just reality. And there was a, desire to, and so we had what you talked about to me before we started this meeting, the new mood and all of this. And now, I think the real turning point and what you have to understand what happens with respect 10 years later is when John Major in 1992, I just Googled it, announces that he's going to finish off what Thatcher did with pit closures. And there's a massive revulsion that sweeps the country. And it also tells you quite a lot about people hadn't been revolted enough not to vote for a Tory again, but this was considered just too much. And so you have these huge demonstrations going on. What do? We have a headline in the paper which calls for a general strike, which creates quite a scandal on some of the old trots who followed what we were doing, because it went against our politics. Our politics had always been, there is no point in small sects calling for general strikes. That's just ridiculous. I mean, it's just, however, we kind of felt that, but we also realized that our task now was to relate to this new political mood, and nobody wants to be behind that. And we did sell a lot of papers. We did recruit a lot of people. There are stories about 10,000 people joining. The membership as a whole reached 10,000 at some point in the 90s. However, the really significant thing about it was that Cliff actually, and I get this from the Ian Birchall biography, so I'm not making it up, Cliff actually begins to suggest in a way which was completely out of line with the whole previous history of the organization, that really the only problem was that the SWP wasn't big enough. And that if we had enough members, we could detonate a major struggle. And I think for many people who joined in the 90s, they don't realize, you see, there's all sorts of completely legitimate complaints you can make about the previous SWP's perspective, but we had a perspective. It might have been shit, but it was a perspective. There was an attempt to relate our objective analysis of the situation with what we should do subjectively. Suddenly, the whole ballpark becomes about how big you are. Now, I think it's important to realize that of all the revolutionary groups in this country, none have had the membership of the Scientologists, right? And in fact, when the Socialist Party, which was the successors of the militant, when they had their largest membership, they were probably less influential than they'd ever been. And this happens as well to the SWP, and you'll remember it, we had bookmarks, we bought up big bookshops to sell, off the back of the previous 10 years of hard work, of course, sponsored by the trade union movement. Marxism had the highest numbers of people coming to it, but it had literally no impact on the outside world at all. And members were instructed, I can remember the phraseology was, we must turn our branches into storm centers, right? This was at the same time as they were demolishing the branches and making them smaller and smaller. Now, voluntarism has its place, but if it's completely disconnected from any analysis of anything that's happening in the world, I think it becomes a problem. And it's at this point, once we'd stopped recognizing that the defeats of the working class over the previous 20 years were important, and we had to calibrate our politics to find a way of relating to it. This is why you were so right about Lukács and the role he played, actually, because you get a complete voluntarism. Sorry for people who are not Marxists, you won't get that, but then you should have been in the SWP for 30 years, then you would. But anyway, the point is that by the late 90s, the whole ball game had been about how many people you could get to your big events. I can remember discussions with comrades from my generation and some from a later generation, and we couldn't work out what was going on because we were so used to the idea that you had to have a perspective which was an analysis of the objective world. And then I had, later on, you were talking about respect. I had this discussion with a particular comrade who was a good friend of mine at the time and whose name I won't mention for the usual reasons. Respect was standing in Southall, and I said, they're going to get slaughtered. And he said, why? And I said, because they're all Hindus and Sikhs. There's absolutely no way, given the politics of India and the history of communalism, that they're going to vote for respect. And look, God love him, not at all a stupid person. But, he comes out with this thing about how predictions like that are what destroy the possibility of victory. And it was all this kind of insane voluntarism. And I could see it at the time, but it kind of didn't matter. But anyway, that's one important part of the backdrop. Trying to race through the years. We were talking about before we started that this is as long a period as between 1935 and 1978. So it's very difficult. But basically, this strange atmosphere within the organization. I always remember Mark Steele wrote a book about how he had he wrote a book about his life, but he had a passage in it where he said that when he was in the SWP, he had a nightmare of sitting in a massive empty room and somebody getting up on a chair and saying, "This is amazing," and that was the kind of atmosphere, of the late 90s, basically. And you had all, the official party line was we were involved in revolutionary recruitment, United Fronts, Pat Stack, whose name I will mention because we're friends. We play Wordle, so it's okay. But, he said to me that I was overestimating the impact of the Communist Party. Maybe he's right. I mean, but the truth is, various forms of United Fronts became ways out because basically any comrade with any experience knew that the organisation was going mad. And so then when you had the prospect of revolutionary recruitment, something which we'd never really been interested in, having long discussions with other leftists, I still have, people say, oh, you're so sectarian, John. That's still in me. I mean, I can't stand most of these people, to be honest. But, this became, something. Then I remember historical materialism. I've had my personal differences with the founders of historical materialism, but it reflected an objective reality that people were getting fed up. If you went to branch meetings at that time, it was so boring. And it was just made up of lunatics, basically. The kind of people who were capable of setting up groups, say, I can remember myself and somebody else in SOAS, I should say it because it was an achievement, Sandy Nicol, people who could pull things like that off had something to them. The kind of people you met at branch meetings just really couldn't. They were just people who had been recruited on the basis they were angry. This became the way you recruited people. My feeling has always been you should avoid people who are just angry. You should actually recruit people who actually have something to offer in terms of doing anything. Anyway, moving swiftly on. Let's talk about 9/11. Let's talk about respect. Okay, so basically 9/11 happens. I have a memory of doing a paper sale outside SOAS. By this stage, by the way, just to illustrate my previous point, Sandy Nicol, it was amazing because I hadn't been in branch meetings in ages, but I was saying we really should go, And I forced him to come to a branch meeting, and the experience was so fucking terrible. Like, neither of us ever went back. I mean, we were immediately tasked with being on the branch committee, being paper organizer, and there was no one else there apart from old, worn-out people. I mean, it was just awful. And you suddenly realised that the SWP was a shell, basically. And all the interesting people were doing other things. They were either involved in the United Fronts or they're involved in historical materialism. And this is the period when Stop the War is being set up, which I have a lot of things to say about that, maybe not this time, but huge demonstrations. I mean, like really huge demonstrations. The SWP was collapsing. I mean, that's not where you went at all for any of that. And I can remember sitting on the steps with a leading comrade who was saying, but are you still in the SWP? And I said, to be honest, formally, but I really don't want to. And Andy can beat me up for this afterwards. I said, I'm more interested in respect, was what I said at the time. And basically what that reflects is that they talked at the time about the shrinking iceberg. You didn't want to be on the fucking shrinking iceberg. And there's this, I'm reminded a bit about what Chris Harman once said about Eastern Europe, that even the leadership didn't believe in the old ideology anymore. It was just obviously not happening. And so you have respect being set up. Now, I think there's two things that are the real story about respect. There's lots I'd want to say about 9/11 and the impact on politics. Perhaps we'll come to that. But I think two very important things about respect. First of all, in reality, it was presented as a way of capturing the political energy of people who opposed the war and, obviously related particularly to Muslim voters. In reality, I think it was about a refusal to ally with the direct action people within Stop the War who wanted to up the level of militancy. And I can remember being told by fairly senior people, look, we can't do that because the trade union leaders won't have it, right? And so this idea of a kind of political intervention, which, sounded reasonable at the time, but in reality, I think it was dodging a set of questions. We'd obviously, and there's so much we could talk about, the destruction of the Socialist Alliance, etc. For comrades listening who know that story, I'm aware of it. I'd have things to say about it, but I won't talk about it. That's the first thing about respect. The second thing I think about respect is there's loads of people who go on and on about too many concessions to Muslims or unrepresentative Muslim organizations, etc. Now, looking back on it 20 years later, I'm quite proud of the fact that we stood up to Islamophobia, which turned out to be one of the main themes of the rising far right, right? One of the things I learned during that whole period was that many of us who'd gone through all the processes we talked about and other processes independently had a far too charitable view of the SWP leadership. And, I thought that they were being intelligent about this. I thought they understood the forces involved in what they were doing. It becomes clear to me, unfortunately, at a later stage, that they really, really didn't. And, that to me is quite astonishing. But for me, the biggest thing isn't about Muslims. It's not about anything like that. It's about the fact that all the time, as the Stop the War movements are getting smaller and smaller, UKIP are on the rise. The far right is rising and laying the basis for the awful last few decades that we've experienced. And we would have debates. I can remember going out for a drink again with a leading comrade, and I was saying, but what are we going to do about UKIP? And the whole debate was about whether they were fascists or not. But there was no, and this is really preempts the current era that we're living through with reform, with the Tory right, etc. We had no clue. The reason why so many people now talk about what's that called? The politics of the horseshoe. The real thing was that these were, it is important to say, very exciting times in some ways. I can remember I was at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and I can remember sitting in the bar and sitting in other places, and you'd have people from bloody Chatham House coming down and telling you how fucking terrible it was that the Blair government had sacked all the Arabists. I can remember one person who sadly passed away saying to me, I said, are you talking about helicopters on the roof? And she said, absolutely worse than helicopters. And these were people who technically, according to our own old politics, were members of the ruling class, and they were having quite serious discussions. I can even remember a very good friend of mine was married to somebody who worked in some capacity for Tony Blair, and she used to ask me about the Stop the War movement, and I was, of course, I wouldn't say a word, and she was going, oh, go on, and actually the atmosphere was, this was a crisis right across, even governing parties, senior ruling class figures. And so it made us feel as if we were leading this huge alliance. The problem was we didn't look at what was happening in terms of what was the real base of the anti-war feeling and how it started to shift. Because actually, as UKIP rise, as the far right rise, their opposition is to forever wars, which basically is a conspiratorial view of the world. Right. And it first became apparent to me, I think, about the time of the Green Movement in Iran, where the Stop the War group and the SWP had a split. Again, why they split isn't just because of objective reality, it's because they were fighting internally. But the reality is that people were not prepared to support the movement against the Iranian dictatorship because this was seen as conflicting with anti-imperialism and serving America. And these confusions grow. One of the points I really wanted to make was I don't think that's because the SWP made concessions to Muslims. I think it was part of something much broader that was starting to shift.
I'd like to talk more generally about this, but I'm conscious of time, and I want to address what is a major thing for me, and I find it hard to express clearly, but it's the contrast between what I remember as being attractive about the international socialist tradition that became the SWP. And a big part of the attraction to me, in a general sense, was this thing about neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism. And they took it seriously. And before I joined the SWP, I'd always been very anti-Stalinist, and I'm always wary of people who had anything good to say about Russia. They always seemed strange to me. It always seemed dubious in some way. So I really respected that when I found that there was a Marxist tradition that rejected that view. But I remember the SWP much more latterly in their relation to international events. I won't go into details, but they just didn't have any of that, and I want to call it a vibe. It just seemed completely absent, that independence. They seem to be tailing the Communist Party.
Yeah.
And this transition from the one to the other seems to me absolutely fundamental to the decline of the SWP. And I know you have some ideas about it, but the way I think about it generally is they start with this neither Washington nor Moscow position. And then, in 1989, you've got collapsing Soviet empire and all of those kind of things. And you might think, and I think some people did at the time, that this would rebound to the benefit of the SWP because people would see they were right. That regime had never been a socialist regime or something like that. And that didn't happen at all. And that's an interesting thing in and of itself. But my point is that what happens when you remove the Moscow is that you just get not a sort of neither Washington. You get an anti-American imperialism, becomes a sort of end in itself. And I can imagine the rational basis of that is that once the Soviet empire had collapsed, there was a lot of room for America to expand into and, pursue its imperial or whatever aim. So I can see why people were wary of that. But it just becomes an obsessive thing. It becomes the explanation for everything. This kind of, I don't even want to call it an anti-Americanism. And I know you've mentioned, I'd like you to talk about that because I think that was a real vibe among the Occupy generation, was this really just that, American imperialism is the thing that it's about. And so I can see the SWP relating to that, but they seem to have absorbed it, and it all seems to have been the means by which they just abandoned their old international understanding.
Let's begin with Alex Klinikos, just briefly. And I'll move very quickly on, don't worry, to the present. But there's this really shocking article, which you've seen because I was posting it around, about the end of the Iran-Iraq war, where he, and this was in 1988, and I have particularly terrible memories of it because I was stupid, and myself and a younger Simon Asaf responded to this article in which he argued that humanitarians might celebrate the end of the Iran-Iraq war. Remember, this is a war where 2 million people had been killed, including, many young Iranian children, and where Saddam Hussein had dropped poison gas on people. And he said, but we Marxists are not humanitarians. Right, or something, humanists or something. It's like you used to defend his defense of Althusser, but it's like, the chickens coming home to roost. Because of the atmosphere we talked about earlier on of always being up on oppression and imperialism and all of that. Obviously, as a 23-year-old, I was hugely inspired by this. And we went to a student party, and when what's-his-name's famous soul track, War, What Is It Good For, came on, we said, fighting US imperialism, and we're dancing around the room. And I think that was genuinely awful. And I think, haven't talked about it and won't at the moment, but I think this was partly the result of the period we discussed in the 80s. There was a kind of Bolshevization that went on in the SWP. And so along with the good things, like being very strong about oppression and stuff, there was this kind of formalization of stuff which earlier generations of IS members would never have accepted. And I think that was awful. I think moving forward, though, I think there's a more general story about what happens to the left as a whole, which by this time, the SWP, as we've discussed, is just trailing anything because the SWP has come to believe that the crisis is deep. All that's required is for us to have more members and more influence, and then we'll be able to launch the revolution. I think at that point, you get loads of, and she's a good egg, Naomi Klein, and her book Snow Logo and the whole thing about disaster capitalism becomes very influential on the left. But it essentially involves a kind of conspiracy theory of globalization, which sees it purely as an attempt to maintain American power. Now, essentially, if you look at the period from the 70s through the 80s through the 90s, what you see is every single state in the world being aware that the previous patterns of accumulation, the previous forms of capitalism, were not working. Of course, it's true that when wars happen, capitalists will try and exploit it. We all know. But what you get is a kind of reversal of the arrow of causality, where, for example, people start to believe that the reason why Bush invaded Iraq was simply to seize control of oil or to benefit Blackwater mercenaries, etc. This was just conspiratorial bullshit. And what I remember most of all, and this is quite weird because you're sitting in SOAS where there are serious people who understood, the dynamics of all of this. You get John Rees writing a piece about how the war in the former Yugoslavia was all about oil pipelines. And this has since become a meme on the far right, all the stuff about oil pipelines, and that's what everything is about. This is a form of false consciousness. This is not what was happening at all. I would argue that the movement against the war is partly the result of globalization, actually. What happens is the promise of the formal discourse of globalization about civil society, about human rights, about democracy, about international law. People are outraged by the way Bush, and there's complete kind of revisionist history about this, by the way, that all liberals supported the war on Iraq. It's really not true, certainly not in Britain, where Kennedy, who was then leader of the Liberal Party, spoke on anti-war platforms. And if you look at Europe, for example, you'll remember the slogan, "Don't attack Chirac." Like the French were absolutely opposed to it. Of course, it's like a joke I sometimes say on Facebook. I mean, Chirac was not a revolutionary socialist and therefore did not support the overturn of the world system. But the reason why the movements against the war were so large is because it broke the kind of post, I guess, 1989 consensus. And it broke politics. And I mean, these are things, I think in many ways the situation we're in today is because of that break, both on the right and the left. But the idea that what happened was simply an expression of globalization, I think on the contrary, it was absolutely the opposite. And what we're seeing now with Trump is, in a way, a part two. I mean, like you can imagine, Bush didn't want to unravel the whole system of American dominance, which had existed since the Second World War. So he was controlled in a way. And you see the Bush administration retreating from Iraq and starting to lift American boots off the ground. It was clearly motivated by political pressures and desires. I can remember sitting with the head of American studies at Birkbeck. Don't ask how that happened. And he was completely mad. And he was telling me, I was saying, don't you think there's a danger that the US overestimates its power? And he said, on the contrary, America has underestimated its power. And now the world is going to see what American power looks like. That's Trump. That's where it started. And the motivations were really not economic, actually. They were due with building a new kind of pattern of power. Now, in trying to insist that all this was happening because of neoliberalism, and I think we just got wrong what was happening. And this becomes clear when you look at the Arab Spring, where many of the forces which globalization itself had unleashed produces rebellions right across the Near East. And it's a very, very inspiring moment. But I can recall, one of the things that, apart from the Iranian example, the way people turned on a dime on Libya is one of the most extraordinary things. Because initially, I can remember sitting in SOAS I was trying to teach and I was just as distracted as I always am. And I was following on my iPhone what was happening in Libya. And I just desperately wanted Gaddafi to resign. And he just wasn't. And NATO, very reluctant to intervene. I think it was largely a French initiative. There was desperate calls from Libyan revolutionaries for some form of intervention because they were scared about what was going to happen in Benghazi, etc. And suddenly, even people who, and we haven't really had a chance to discuss it, but people I've fallen out with very badly since, but who I think were very principled on these questions. I was really shocked, actually, even at the time, when Richard Seymour, who had supported the Arab revolutions entirely honourably, as soon as NATO carries out a few bombings, he's suddenly saying these revolutionaries, have allowed themselves to become servants of NATO. And I was like, what the fuck? If and then produces a kind of strategy and tactics discussion of the military balance of forces. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous, actually, to be doing that in London, And since then, this whole, if you go on social media and you look at the far right's discourse on this, and I think the far right exists in the global south just as much as it does in the global north, the conspiratorial bullshit about Gaddafi setting up a special banking system and the wonderful life that people had in Libya, this has now become the dominant discourse. And there's nobody on the left challenging it. And I just find it, and in fact, nobody can be bothered to even reconstruct a basic history of this period.
I am very aware of the time, and I don't know how you want to wrap up, really, because there was a couple of things. I mean, I think we ought to say what next for the SWP, which I don't think there's anything next for the SWP.
I have to admit that it's a question which concerns me no more than about 5 minutes every year.
Well, I think I've probably covered it, to be honest with you. But, for the sake of completeness, whenever I hear about them now, they're just in such a dismal state. But I'm not going to dwell on that because there's two things. So one, do you want to say anything else in terms of wrapping that up? Because to me, the stuff about, for example, Syria, their behaviour and stop the war around Syria, because they'd all become the same people. That was really disgraceful. And for me, they'd crossed some kind of line. And that's the kind of line I wanted us to draw for the people listening, just so we can end our story, as it were.
I mean, we haven't sort of discussed the rape case and all of that and how the SWP actually fell apart. I would say today, Ukraine and Syria were the main breaking points for me. Because when the rape case happened, I had I think not entirely wrong idea that this was a result of a bureaucratized organization which had no real purpose for existence anymore. And things like that will happen in authoritarian commandist organizations where there's no accountability. It's just like in any office where you have a manager who can just get away with doing anything. Somebody is going to do anything. I mean, like always. And it was particularly shocking, of course, for us because we knew some of the people who ended up collaborating with it and stuff, but we shouldn't have been so shocked because actually any kind of real debate had atrophied by that time. It was, I think, the WRP by that point of time. It was pointless. But even then, I could still not go through this whole thing that I've gone through after Ukraine and Syria of rethinking my politics much more generally. I mean, it's Ukraine and Syria which made me rethink my politics at a much more general level. In some ways, it was more important. And it was important because it wasn't just about the SWP. It was about the entire left. I mean, like when you have Jeremy Corbyn, after the Salisbury poisonings, saying that we should cooperate with Russia. And then you have not Jeremy Corbyn himself, I hasten to add, but you have people, some of them senior academics, reposting stuff by people claiming it was the Zionists who did it. I mean, at that point, this trajectory towards conspiracy theory and bad explanations has really reached a particular kind of level which you can no longer tolerate. And there's so much I'd want to cover. I mean, I haven't talked about Gaza. I haven't talked about all sorts of things that I want to really talk about. But what I would say, I talked about the importance of perspective, right? My perspective today is that the main battle in the world is not between neoliberalism and left or right populism. The main battle in the world is between authoritarianism and the kind of thing which you saw growing in the 90s, which was a concern for civil society, for human rights, for a more equitable distribution globalization. When people want a solution, I worry sometimes that there's a Leninist-shaped hole there. I mean, they imagine that it's possible to have a kind of scientific worldview which will explain all their problems and explain everything. I think we need to develop a perspective which understands the massive shift to the right which has occurred in global politics over the last 20 years. And we need to understand that the main enemy now is not neoliberalism. The main enemy now is an emerging world of multipolarity, which is really just another word for classical imperialism when you think about it. It's competition between authoritarian states and would-be authoritarian states. The battle in America is not over yet, I don't think, but it seems pretty clear. We need a politics which isn't about sort of making a gradient of who is the most oppressed and who is the least oppressed. I mean, I think something which is really ubiquitous now, particularly on social media, and which really reflects, in a way, a very American idea that the system is basically sound, and all we need is a kind of procedural, legalistic way of deciding who is suffering most. I mean, to go back to that old 80s form of politics, we need to oppose all racism, all oppression, regardless of how oppressed or how much people suffer. We need to be absolutely opposed to these things. What we need to do, because in one of our previous discussions, I was, I think, in some ways rightly accused of hoping that the centre holds. But what we need to have is a principled opposition to authoritarianism, to right-wing populism, to anti-democratic ideologies, which isn't afraid, for example, to call out Venezuela as much as they'll call out the US, which isn't afraid to condemn Israel's genocide in Gaza, but also isn't afraid to talk about the reality that Hamas are an extremely undemocratic organization. And there are all kinds of questions there about what has happened to radical anti-imperialism in an era when there are no longer actually progressive left-wing anti-imperialists actually operating, fighting anti-imperialist battles. These are tricky questions, really difficult questions to talk about in the current context, but we need to create some kind of space where we can talk about these questions. So my big problem with the left at the moment is, what I find personally is you get stuck between, on the one hand, idiot kind of leftists who are just knee-jerk kind of people about everything, and on the other hand, opportunist liberal centrists. And in a strange way, I think it's a bit like the situation of the left in the 50s. I think there is a comparison. And one of the things, actually, I'll just conclude on this. I don't know how much interest it will be to people, but I remember, and these are some of the worst days of my life, but after the SWP split, trying to argue with people that if you look back to the 1950s, what people did wasn't just try and set up another organization to duplicate the reality. They set up something called the Club, and they tried to orchestrate new discussions about how to confront the reality. And if only, when I look at some of the fragments of the SWP, it's incredible that there was literally no one who was arguing against a left which saw Ukrainians defending themselves against Russia as an intra-imperialist conflict and all that. Absolute fucking nonsense. There was nobody who was prepared to say that it was a disgrace that Syrians were thrown off of stop the war demonstrations, sometimes physically, by the way, protesting people who were opposing any action to prevent their children from being gassed. This is as bad as anything the Russians did in 1956
Exactly.
and their supporters in Western countries.
Exactly.
And it is a tragedy that a left that came out of the 50s couldn't see that and instead continued, and this is maybe the real point, about crisis of leadership. They just continued with the very worst traditions of chasing after whatever the left was saying. And Twitch, fine. If you want to do that, do it. But don't pretend you have a right to exist as a separate organisation. What are you for? You know, so I remain a proud sectarian.
Thanks for all that. We had this, with the way we even set this up, there was always a thing between how are we going to talk about what we have deep experience of, which is the SWP, but also make that reflect on the rest of the left. And I think I think you've managed to do that. But I think we're going to disappoint some people, like my mate Phil, who said, you guys need to conclude by saying, where next. And I agree with you. We don't really know. But the point of departure for me, and I think where we immediately agreed, was that the SWP and the rest of the left had completely failed to respond in any meaningful way to the threat of Trump. And that, for me, I said to you, it was like passing the event horizon of the SWP, going in the outward direction. I finally felt like I had nothing.
I really do not care what the SWP or its remnants do. I mean, quite seriously, it's not about personal bitterness or anything. I don't think that's the future. I just genuinely don't. What I'm interested in is, can you build the kinds of movements which you saw in the 90s around international civil society, around those kinds of things, which could be quite militant. I mean, you'll remember, Andy, the Wombles, like on those demos and stuff. Can you, I'm probably more right-wing than you in some ways. So, I'm just giving you a pass there. But there's actually quite a lot of choice of escaping that kind of a left, which I just genuinely don't think has much to offer anymore.
I don't know what my politics are clearly anymore, but I feel like a radical, and what really strikes me is how none of the left seem radical to me anymore. They seem like they're simping to all kinds of imperialism and whatnot. But I hope we've managed to communicate some of that, why we think that, to some of our listeners.
Can I just say just one thing in conclusion? Because I'm aware I'm a renegade, but I think in our present time, it's a very unusual kind of renegacy, because my being a renegade is motivated by real anger and fear about where the world is going, and the certain knowledge that the people who continue to repeat these platitudes literally aren't even thinking about what to do about it. And that worries me. I feel personally frightened by it. And so that's what motivates me.
Amen. Yeah. Thanks very much, John, for joining me 3 times now. It's been such a fascinating discussion. And thank you to anybody else who joined us once again for the Traveller in the Evening podcast. And as I always end these shows, I remind people that, but however you end up hearing them, please come and visit my blog at travellerintheevening.com. That's it. It's my Substack, Traveller in the Evening, no spaces. That's it, .com. And then you'll please subscribe, and then you'll hear about future podcasts and whatnot that we do on the blog. So thanks again, John, and thanks everybody else.